And some people have been saying, well, doesn't this show that anything is possible provided you put your mind to it? And I want to answer that by saying, well, yes and no. The yes is that, yeah, it does indeed show that when governments really put their mind to things, they can come up with quite strong answers incredibly quickly, and they can go beyond normal ideological divisions as they do so. So this government, this Conservative government in the UK, for example, is doing things for unemployed workers now that they would never have done a few months ago, or even, frankly, a few weeks ago. This is a time, because it's an emergency, which goes beyond ideology and beyond party politics. And that chimes in with a key idea of Extinction Rebellions, that is where we ought to be in an emergency. And of course, there's more than one emergency afflicting the world today. So the government's done quite extraordinary things in this country and in many other countries. The scale of those things, it's very much to be welcomed. In terms of the UK context, we might say fairly, it turns out there is a magic money tree. It turns out the governments can basically do whatever they want if they think the need is serious enough. But what is that need? What is the need that governments are responding to? And here is where my no comes in. Because I think we need to be very careful not to overread what's happening. Yes, it's very encouraging that the government is doing very radical, dramatic things, including things it doesn't want to do ideologically, because that gives a precedent. That gives the precedent to the possibility of a Green New Deal, a just transition, and so forth in time to come. But I think it's very important to be clear about what the government is not doing. And what the government is not doing still, it's better than it was, but what it's not doing still is taking adequate precautionary action on the pandemic itself. And that's why, as some of you will be aware, I've been arguing that there is a very obvious way, a very clear way, in which what the government is doing is entirely inadequate. And I'm going to put here in the chat box, if you haven't seen it yet, do go to the chat box. For most of you, it'll be on the right. I'm going to put in the chat box here, and I'll show it on the screen for a moment. There you go. The video that I've just done sort of on this, which has gone viral, it's got over 500,000 views now in just a couple of days across platforms. And in this video, I argue that the government's response to the pandemic itself, as opposed to the economic disruption, has still been grossly inadequate. So that's the distinction that I want to make, that if you look at countries like the USA and the UK, their response to the economic disruption caused by the pandemic, which of course is important, has been very strong. But their response to the pandemic itself has not been very strong. And that is something which I think should worry us. It should worry us because it suggests that we shouldn't be over-impressed by the dramatic action that the government is taking on the economic disruption. What they're doing on the economy is in many respects necessary and to be welcomed, especially when they're contemplating doing things like nationalizing the railways and so on and so forth, things that kind of make sense anyway, frankly. But in terms of the action they're taking on the pandemic, that has not observed, this has been my key argument for the last month, that has not observed the precautionary principle. It hasn't stayed ahead of the curve. It hasn't stayed ahead of the virus. So while they've acted very strongly on the economy, on people's lives, they haven't acted very strongly. So as I say, that should worry us. If you think about this in relation to the climate and ecological emergency, the long, slower emergency, which is playing out right now, of course, has been playing out for years and will play out for years, probably after coronavirus becomes history. You observe to some extent the same kind of pattern. The government sometimes acts, never as strongly as it's acted on this corona crisis, but the government sometimes acts on the economic side of things, but it rarely acts in any kind of remotely adequate way in terms of actually tackling the root causes of the problem, in terms of obeying the precautionary principle, in terms of taking care of ecosystems, taking care of our life support systems on the planetary level, taking care of non-human animals, and indeed even taking care of humans, certainly taking care of the generations to come. The time scale in terms of the climate and ecological emergency is years, decades, even centuries. The time scale in terms of the coronavirus is days or weeks. Very, very different timescales. But it seems to me that the fundamental pattern that we observe is the same. That governments are much more willing to intervene economically than they are to intervene to actually make things better and save people's lives. And to put this quite bluntly, and this is the argument I make in the video that you can see if you go to that link on screen if you haven't seen it yet. To put this quite bluntly, the argument I would like to make is that what governments like ours and also the American government have been tempted to do is to save the economy and not to save lives. And that's why, for example, we still have workers working on HS2 here in the UK. That's why we still have workers working unnecessarily on construction sites. Most of those construction sites, there's no emergency. They don't need to be doing that. They're out there working and spreading the virus because the government doesn't want to contract the economy more than they have to. So they are willing, tragically, as Dominic Cummings was overheard saying at a meeting, they are willing to sacrifice the lives of some of the old people and ill people in this country. And of course, coronavirus actually does affect young people as well. We just had a 19-year-old die here in the UK. They are willing to sacrifice some of those lives, it seems, if that helps save the economy. So that takes us to these measures to save the economy and the concept of carbon bailouts. And one of the things that we're arguing very strongly in Extinction Rebellion right now is that now is not the time to save the very industries which got us into this trouble. And by this trouble, I mean the climate and ecological emergency, but I also mean the trouble of this pandemic. How so? Well, let me give a very obvious and very important example. It would be quite wrong, as seems to be being somewhat resisted in the UK right now, but not in the US. It would be quite wrong to bail out the airlines. Because the airlines are not only devastating us in terms of our future, our ecological and climate future, the airlines' mass air travel is quite obviously, quite categorically responsible for the rapid spread of this pandemic. And here is something which is really quite worrying about the time that we find ourselves in. When this pandemic started to emerge, and colleagues of mine such as Nassim Taleb, using the precautionary principle, said, look, we need to move fast to stop travel around the world, to rein it in drastically, because if we don't, we're going to have a global pandemic really, really fast. We need to move fast to institute quarantine regimens where appropriate and so on. That just didn't seem possible. That just didn't seem to cross anybody's mind as a possibility. The idea that we would sort of voluntarily give up the hypermobility, the massive physical interconnectivity around the world that we've become used to, the idea that we would give that up just seemed to be impossible to people, ungraspable. And it's only started to become graspable too late, as we actually started to see the body bags and the body counts going up. So it's absolutely clear that our vulnerability to this kind of pandemic, and this will not be the last pandemic like this, because of the damage we're doing to the climate, because of the damage we're doing to ecosystems, because of the way we treat non-human animals, it's likely that there'll be more of these pandemics getting worse probably into the future for quite a long time to come, unless Extinction Rebellion wins. There's going to be more of these pandemics, and if we're serious about not letting them get as bad as this one is going to get, because be very clear, we're still in the early stages virtually of this in countries like the UK. The mortality figures are going to carry on rising for quite a long time. If we're serious about being able to rein in those kind of pandemics and make them, or cut them off at source, and make ourselves less vulnerable, then we're going to have to get serious about changing our assumed reliance on mass air travel and cruises and the various other things which cause the trouble. The various things, especially mass air travel, which make the difference between the situation we're in now and the situation that was present 100 years ago during the last comparable event, which was the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu traveled at the speed of steamships. Coronavirus has traveled at the speed of jet planes. And that, in a nutshell, is why we could have predicted, and some of us did predict, that this was going to get very bad months ago, unless we were willing to stop business as usual. So the airlines shouldn't be bailed out. The fossil fuel companies shouldn't be bailed out. These enterprises, if they're likely to economically fail, they should either be allowed to fail or they should be taken over by the state, and the state should decide what to do with them. And what the state should decide in the case of organizations such as airline companies and fossil fuel companies is to start to reduce them, start to downgrade them, start to make them less dangerous and damaging to ourselves and to our common future. So, right now, in the UK and in many countries around the world, unprecedentedly, most of us are locked down. And I'm talking to you from my study here. You can see my bookshelf behind me there. Not the tidiest in the world, but it's a real live bookshelf. In my own home, we're all getting to see a bit more of certain people's homes than we used to before this lockdown phenomenon. Right now, we're locked down and we're not able to engage in most forms of nonviolent direct action or other forms of protest. Something which is very, very important right now is that we speak out to stop the wrong kind of changes being made in response to this crisis right now. It's not time yet to talk about the world that will come out of Corona and how different that will be. And I mean, it's not time yet in the sense that it's premature. It's premature to know what that world will look like, and it's premature to spend too much time working on it at a time when people are dying and more people are going to die for quite a long time to come yet. But right now is the time for making sure that we don't start to go down the wrong direction right now. So that's why I would urge you, if you're one of perhaps millions of people who are not quite certain what to do with some of this time that you've got, a very, very worthwhile thing to do with it is to try to make sure that you intervene in the ways that are open to you to try to make sure that we don't have dodgy carbon bailouts. And what might that mean? It might mean writing to your MP, the old standard stuff. It might mean writing letters to the paper. It might mean something a bit more radical. It might be some kind of fuller-on digital activism or even hacktivism. There are all sorts of possibilities. The bottom line is we need right now to make sure that the vast amounts of money that the governments around the world, and especially I'm talking about our own government here in the UK with its vast package, that the money that these governments are putting into, oops, my screen went off for a second there, sorry, that the money that these governments are putting into these companies, that they're putting into carbon bailouts and so forth, well, that doesn't happen, right? We have to be vigilant now to make sure that that doesn't happen. This money is being doled out now because governments are terrified of the consequences of a short period of economic inactivity, which is one of the reasons, as I say, why the British lockdown is less full than it should be. So the time is now for saying no to those dubious ways of spending our money, because of course the government is ultimately asked or responsible to us, for spending our money to prop up the very kinds of organizations that are at the root of making the climate and ecological emergency worse, and at the root or near the root of making us vulnerable to pandemics. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll throw it open to you. I can see a lot of questions and stuff already in the chat, which is great, and I'll start taking some of those. I want to say one more thing before then. I'm using this word vulnerable quite a lot, and I think it's very important in the context that we're in. Some of you will be aware that I've been arguing along with a few other colleagues in Extinction Rebellion for a while that one of the things that we need to do is enable people around the world to understand just how extreme our vulnerability is to climatic devastation and to the knock-on effects of ecological destruction. And one of the things which is really important, I think, about this corona crisis is that we're getting a kind of shared experience around our countries and around the world of our vulnerability together to a kind of crisis which, although it's unlikely to bring about a collapse event in our societies, could conceivably do so. I'm just going to quote for a second from my book, This Civilization is Finished, some of you might be aware of, which you can find for free online as an ebook for pay as you want if you want to read it. I wrote this book last year, and on page 4 of the book, I wrote this. This civilization might collapse as a result of climatic instability, leading, for instance, to catastrophic food shortages as a probable mechanism of collapse. Or maybe sooner than that, through nuclear war or financial collapse leading to massive breakdown or pandemic. There are a number of ways in which societies like ours could collapse. And it's important that we understand our vulnerability to that kind of potential collapse. And what I'm saying is, I think we are starting to understand it now in the coronavirus situation. And in particular, I want to home in on something that I mentioned there in that quotation from This Civilization is Finished. I want to mention our vulnerability to potential food shocks, which is something that in Extinction Rebellion we've been talking about a lot for the last 6 months or so, especially. And this potentially is very real right now. Think about a country like the UK, chronically unable to feed itself, and now some crops not being planted, harvested, etc., in the fields because we're short of labour out there. And meanwhile, a lot of countries are stopping food exports because of the crisis. There are supply chain issues, of course, because of blockages at borders and so on and so forth. There are issues to do with people having stockpiled food and there being a lot of demand. We're in a situation where some people, especially obviously those who we traditionally call the vulnerable, where some people are actually in a quite dangerous situation vis-a-vis where they're going to get their food from potentially in the next few weeks or even months. And if these kinds of factors carry on, and if we get some bad luck with weather, well, then we could be into a really quite bad situation of food shortage. The kind of situation that, as I say, we've been warning about for a while. The kind of situation that should be dealt with by getting rid of our crazy just-in-time food delivery system, which makes us vulnerable, massively reducing food waste, eating much lower on the food chain, and so on and so forth. Now, what should be our response to that in terms of the emergency situation that we're in right now vis-a-vis coronavirus? So I want to end with this bold suggestion, although I'm not the only one making this suggestion. Professor Tim Lang, who is basically the world expert in this, has made it before me. I want to suggest that actually a sensible policy to take up at this point in a country like the UK would be food rationing. Food rationing was what we had during World War II. As is well known, it worked splendidly then. It kept the population healthy. It's made the society more equal. And most importantly, it meant that people weren't scared about where their next meal was coming from, because that's a situation we've had now, some of in this country and other countries like the US. People being frightened. And that's why some people stockpile or hoard, and then some food gets wasted, which is, really disastrous at a time like this. If our government is actually really serious in going beyond ideology and beyond party politics, if in that sense it's rising to the kind of challenge that Extinction Rebellion has always set out of trying to be beyond party politics, of trying to take seriously that in an emergency, normal rules get suspended, then I think that's what our government will do. It will investigate the case for food rationing, and it will decide that actually this is a prudent measure to take at this point, to make sure that the slightly dodgy situation we're in vis-a-vis food right now in a country like the UK does not become a situation where you end up having real social disharmony, unrest, and indeed malnutrition or undernutrition. So yeah, I'm going to stop now. I hope that's given you all some good food for thought. Just to very briefly recap, I hope that as you sit within your house at this time without possibly much else to do, although of course many of you will be working from home or whatever. But if you're somebody who's like, yeah, I'm frustrated, I can't do my normal activism or something, think about doing some activism around stopping bailouts of the very people who have got us into the dodgy, vulnerable situation that we are in. And think about being quite bold as you think about what to argue for in this context. As I say, if you haven't heard it before, you heard it here first. The rational response, the way to keep us safe, the way to be precautious at this time in countries like the UK, I would argue, is for us to move relatively speedily towards food rationing as the only fair way and unscary way of dealing with the common vulnerability that we now find ourselves in. All right, so thanks for listening to that. Let's have a look at what we've got in some of the chats here. Okay, yeah, so here's an interesting one. Rillian says, we could have done with rationing a few weeks ago with all the canned goods disappearing off the shelves. Allowing maximum 4 items just encouraged more hoarding. And I think that's basically right. But better late than never. The point that I'm making is that if we had that kind of food rationing, then yeah, we would have headed that problem off at the pass. But why don't we institute it now before things get a lot worse? Because let's be clear, things could get a lot worse. As I say, if we get unlucky with the weather, if supply chains start to break down more, if the pandemic takes a really awful path in this country, and I've argued in the video that I saw that I put on the screen at the start, the link that I put on the screen at the start, I've argued in that video that which has now been watched 500,000 times, that things are, because of UK government inaction and failure to observe the precautionary principle, things are going to get a lot worse in the UK for quite a long time with this pandemic. So given